A black waiter with a forgotten past. A wealthy woman running from hers. One haunting song in a luxury restaurant rewrites everything. What begins as a dare turns into a reckoning of identity, regret, and redemption. You won't believe how music brought two worlds crashing into truth. The late afternoon sun blazed through the tall windows of the Everly Room, casting golden light across the polished brass door handles. Brilliant yet distant, a silent reminder that Elijah Carter was stepping into a world that never truly felt like his own. He adjusted his black tie, the crisp white shirt pressed to perfection. Every motion as practice as breathing. After 8 years working at Savannah, George's most prestigious fine dining restaurant, the routine was etched into his bones. Elijah entered through the employee entrance, nodding at the familiar sounds. The hiss of pans, the rhythmic chop of knives, and Chef Miguel barking orders in a booming voice that blended Spanish and English with authoritative warmth. Elijah, early as always, huh? Chef Miguel flashed a warm smile. Table 7's the mayor's office tonight. Don't give them anything to complain about, yeah? Yes, Chef, Elijah replied softly, his deep voice even, as he stowed his bag in his locker. Inside it was a music scorebook, an old habit left over from his teaching days. A part of his past he quietly held on to. At 35, Elijah carried the calm demeanor of someone who had weathered storms. Every step, every nod, moved an internal rhythm. But few knew this quiet man once stood on the cusp of stardom, a rising baritone at the Atlanta Conservatory of Arts. That dream dissolved long ago in the face of polite but hollow rejections. Not the right image. Our audience may not respond well, or worse, the kind of silence that echoed longer than any no. Elijah never lashed out. He chose instead to fade into the background, to move quietly between white linen tables, pouring wine at the correct temperature, aligning napkins with precision, offering smiles that never reached too far. His calm was armor, a second skin concealing the storm beneath. Seen the new girl yet? Brenda Holloway whispered as they checked crystal glasses. Elijah glanced toward the young woman, fumbling with a bottle of red. First day. Everyone's hands have shaken like that before. He smiled gently, eyes soft. Though the world had turned its back on him, Elijah never lost his kindness. And music, no matter how deeply buried, still echoed in every step he took, every breath he drew, like a distant memory refusing to go silent. The sharp click of Louboutin heels echoed through the marble hallway of the Whitmore Real Estate Tower. On the 36th floor, the corner office with a sweeping view of the Savannah River belonged to Madison Whitmore, the kind of woman no one ever dared call soft. She entered the room like stepping onto a stage, every movement exacting, every expression deliberate. At 30, Madison was the youngest name on Southern Business Magazine's 40 Under 40. To investors, she was the embodiment of precision and drive. To herself, she was still a question left unanswered. Your coffee, no sugar, extra espresso. Riley Jennings, her assistant, placed the cup with ritualistic efficiency. The zoning board meeting's been moved to tomorrow afternoon. Brambleton Hotel called back. They're pushing for an additional 5% equity. Madison didn't look up. Cut them off. We don't negotiate with people who don't know how to play by the rules. Her eyes drifted toward the floor-to-ceiling window, where the last rays of sunlight spilled against the glass walls, as if trying to pierce through the fog in her gaze. But her attention stopped at a small silver picture frame on her desk. A photo of a curly-haired woman beaming beside a grand piano. Grace Whitmore, Madison's mother. Grace had once been a gifted pianist, destined for grand stages. But she refused to compromise with prejudice. Instead, she chose a quieter life, teaching music to underprivileged children, her brilliance tucked away in simplicity. Madison had chosen the opposite path. She entered the world of wealth and power, where there was no room for sentiment or lofty ideals. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father. Tomorrow marks 10 years. If you want to visit your mother's grave, I'll be waiting. She didn't respond. Instead, she slipped on her blazer, fastened a polished Versace button, and strode out of the office. Tonight was her birthday, celebrated at the Everly Room. A radiant, curated evening, except for the widening crack in her chest, where the sound of her mother's piano still echoed like a melody left unfinished. That night, the Everly room felt less like a birthday party and more like a formal gala. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above pristine white linen-covered tables. The clink of glassware rang out like an opulent symphony. Madison Whitmore sat at the head of a grand table, a nexus of Savannah's power players, wearing a bold red dress, a statement of control and elegance. She laughed, raised her glass, receiving toasts like a queen ruling over an empire of her own making. Elijah Carter stood just off to the side, near the wine station. His black suit was pressed to perfection, the cuff of his white shirt extending exactly a quarter-inch beyond the sleeve. He moved fluidly between tables, eyes always slightly lowered, never submissive, just precise. There was something about his presence that made people pause, unsure whether he was a server or an artist misplaced in a world not quite his own. Then came the voice from a man at Madison's table, slurred slightly with wine. "I hear there's a waiter here who studied at a conservatory. Who knows, maybe he could sing Happy Birthday for our lovely hostess." At that moment, Madison was lifting her glass when her eyes flicked toward the service station, landing on Elijah as he adjusted the wine glasses. The chandelier's light refracted against the polished surface of a piano tucked in the corner, a rarely used relic, yet still dusted daily. She froze, not because of the piano, but because of Elijah's eyes, the way they softened, sharpened, and flickered just for a moment as he glanced at it. A quiet gaze, touched with sorrow yet full of knowing. That was what Madison saw. It was the same look her mother used to have when she sat alone at the piano after lessons. It passed quickly, but for someone who had grown up beside an artist, Madison recognized it instantly. The expression of someone who once lived in the world of music and never truly left. She turned back toward the table, ready to make a casual remark, but it caught in her throat. One breath, then she spoke, clear and deliberate. "Your name's Elijah, right?" Madison asked, her voice a half-smile, half-dare. "I hear you studied music at the Atlanta Conservatory?" Elijah paused, caught off guard. She continued, "Tonight's a special occasion. Sing something for me. Something classic. Something with weight. Like Grace Eternal. My mother used to play it every Sunday morning. I think it would be interesting to hear in your voice." Elijah stilled in the frozen silence of the room. His fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray in his hands. He knew that tone well, a request wrapped in sweetness and status, but with the subtle pressure of command. He looked directly at her, his eyes steady, unafraid. "I'm just a server, Miss Whitmore. I don't get paid to perform." Madison tilted her head, voice still honey but sharp as a blade beneath. "But it's not every day we get to hear someone like you sing, is it?" The silence stretched. Elijah could hear his own heartbeat, and beneath it, his grandmother's voice echoing in memory. Music isn't to entertain the powerful. It's to free the soul. He set the tray down. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped to the center of the room. "If that's what you want, I'll sing. But not to amuse. To remind you of something you've forgotten." He drew in a deep breath, and in that moment, the first note rang out, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's voice filled the Everly room. A rich baritone, warm and full, shaped by years of discipline but roughened by a life lived in the shadows. Grace Eternal, a hymn anyone might recognize, yet in Elijah's voice, it became something else entirely. Not a church melody, but a living prayer, quiet and devastating, reaching deep into the heart of every person listening. Madison Whitmore sat frozen in her chair. The wine glass in her hand trembled slightly, sending faint ripples across the surface, mirroring the quake in her chest. The friends around her, businessmen, investors, lawyers, people used to bend in the world with money and words, were still now. No one dared to speak. No one moved to interrupt the sacredness unfolding. In that moment, Madison wasn't the hostess. She wasn't the mogul. She was just a child again, sitting by her mother's piano. Madison had intended to unsettle Elijah, to make him feel small before the powerful. But now, it was she who could no longer conceal her unease. That voice, there was something in it she hadn't felt in years. Memory returned quickly and uninvited. A winter morning in their Beacon Hill apartment, the sound of piano drifting from the living room, and her mother Grace Whitmore, seated at the old upright, hair pin high, eyes closed, completely lost in that very piece of music. She had once thought her mother was weak for not chasing a career on the stage. She had once scoffed at the free lessons her mother gave to kids with no future. But now, through a few bars sung by a black waiter, Madison felt the full depth of the music her mother had protected. Not for fame, but to reach the soul. Elijah wasn't performing. He was telling a story. And each note, each phrase, seemed to summon the unnamed griefs buried deep within Madison. Loss, regret, a sense of being unmoored. When Elijah reached the final line, "And grace will lead me home," his voice softened, not fading, but as if pulling the room into a collective breath. There was no applause, no whispers, only a weighted silence, the kind no one dared to break, because they all knew they had witnessed something that transcended the formalities of a birthday party. Madison bowed her head, her heart clenched with a sudden, sharp ache. For the first time in years, the voice of pride inside her fell silent. In its place came her mother's voice, and with it, memories she had tried to forget. It wasn't shame from being embarrassed. It was a deeper kind of shame, the kind that comes when you realize you've trampled something sacred in pursuit of something hollow. Elijah gave a slight nod, then stepped away. No rush, no pride. He returned to his tray of wine glasses as if nothing had happened. But Madison knew everything had changed, and she remained seated, hands clasped tightly together, eyes following a silhouette. As tears began to fall, silently, she sat there long after Elijah's song had faded into the air, the chair beside her now empty. The laughter and clinking glasses had dissolved into a soft murmur. Behind her, she kept her head bowed, gripping her hands as if even one deep breath would cause everything she was feeling to spill out. In the dim glow of the Everly room, her mother's image stood clearer than ever. Grace Whitmore, the woman with soft curls and gifted hands, had once spent hours at that old piano, playing Grace Eternal with all the love and sincerity in her being. Back then, Madison had only complained. Why did her mother teach kids who didn't own nice shoes or have any future? Why turn down performance contracts just to run a community music class in South Savannah? Now, her mother's words came back, whispered alongside every lingering note from Elijah's voice. Music isn't for proving yourself to the world. It's for holding on to the part of you that stays human. Across the restaurant, Elijah stood at the bar, drying glasses. His hands moved with steady rhythm, but his gaze was lost in the distance. He wasn't looking at anyone. He wasn't speaking. But inside him, an earthquake had erupted. It had been years since he walked away from a New York Symphony Theater, the stage that once held his highest dream. Back then, a lead role in La Tragedia was practically his, until a few influential sponsors voiced concerns that a black tenor as a romantic lead would be aesthetic mismatch for our audience. He hadn't been passed over for lack of talent, but because of the color of his skin. Elijah left New York, left the dream behind entirely. He stopped singing, stopped believing his voice deserved to be heard by anyone. But tonight, for just a moment, everything returned: memory, pain, and yes, light. No one knew that after that impromptu performance, Elijah had quietly gone home, opened an old drawer in his modest apartment, and pulled out his worn sheet music and a faded photograph, himself, center stage of the Atlanta Conservatory of Arts. As for Madison, she didn't step into her car immediately after leaving the restaurant. She stood beneath the soft drizzle coating Savannah's cobblestone streets, looking up at the sky, and for the first time in years, she cried, not for a lost deal or a broken ambition, but for something larger, a forgotten piece of herself, now revived to the voice of a server named Elijah Carter. 3 days after that night, Madison Whitmore returned to the Everly room, not in a Versace gown, no meticulously styled makeup, but in a light gray wool coat and flats. She entered through the main doors, alone and without requesting a VIP table. Elijah was behind the bar, wiping down the counter. When he noticed her, he didn't show much, just a polite professional nod. But inside, a sudden swell rose in his chest. Madison didn't sit down. She walked directly to the bar, laid a thin folder on the counter, and spoke. "I know about New York. I read everything." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. The folder's label was clear: Elijah Carter, scholarship recipient, Atlanta Conservatory of Arts, lead tenor, New York Symphony Theater, projected. Inside was a 2013 article with a blurred headline: Casting Controversy Raises Questions About Representation in Classical Opera. I read it all, Madison said, her voice lower now. I saw my mother go through the same thing. People loved her music. They just didn't want her at the center of the stage because she chose to teach black and Latinx students. From her coat pocket, she drew out an old photograph. Grace Whitmore seated at a piano, surrounded by a circle of children, Latino, black, and brown faces all beaming up at her. Grace's eyes were alight, radiant with a kind of joy that didn't care about social boundaries. I used to hate it, Madison said quietly. I thought she was wasting her talent. Until I heard you sing. The space between them hung in a gentle, emotional hush. Elijah looked at the photo, then at her, and for the first time, he saw something different in Madison's eyes. No longer the polished armor of success, but a silent apology. My grandmother's name was Lisa, Elijah replied. She taught music at a small church in South Atlanta. She used to say, when your voice rises, don't let it be just sound. Let it reach someone. And in that moment, inside a high-end restaurant in the heart of Savannah, two distant worlds touched through a language that required no pretense. Music, memory, and the quiet courage to open one's heart. 2 weeks after that conversation at the bar, Madison Whitmore invited Elijah to a modest address on Liberty Street, just a few blocks from downtown Savannah. A weathered sign swung gently on a rusted hinge above a dark wooden door. Whitmore Legacy Studio. Music for every soul. Dust clung to the glass pane. Madison turned an old key, the metal groaning softly, then pushed the door open. My mother taught here for the last 10 years of her life, she said, her voice dipping. I've kept everything exactly the way she left it. Inside, the dust lay like a soft shroud across every surface. On the piano keys, on the shelves lined with worn sheet music. A piano stood in the corner, its cover yellowed with time. Elijah stepped in slowly, his hand brushing over faded pages, as if reading the notes still hidden within them. I want to reopen this place, Madison said, her eyes locked on Elijah, not as a museum, but as a continuation. Elijah stayed silent. I want you to be the program director, she said. To teach students the world tends to forget, like my mother did. Elijah turned to her. Why me? Madison took a deep breath. Because you don't just understand it in your mind, you feel it in your soul. And because I believe you've never stopped teaching, even in silence. She stepped closer to the piano and gently lifted the lid from the keys. I know I was wrong, but I don't just want to apologize. I want to do something about it. And I need someone who can lead the way. At that moment, a bell rang at the front door. A boy, around 12, brown-skinned, in a worn hoodie, stood hesitantly in the frame. Do you teach piano here? He asked. Both Elijah and Madison turned toward him. Madison hesitated, caught off guard. But Elijah stepped forward, his voice gentle. Have you ever played before? The boy shrugged. I've only heard my mom sing, but I want to learn. Elijah glanced at Madison. She nodded. He turned back to the boy with a soft smile. Then come in. Let's get you started on your first chord. Over the next 6 weeks, Whitmore Legacy Studio awakened from its long slumber. Madison personally led the renovation, calling contractors, overseeing budgets, drawing funds from her mother's memorial foundation. Elijah, at first just a quiet observer, began sweeping shelves, wiping each piano key, until those trial lessons for a few kids like the one from that day became real, growing classes. He started scribbling notes, crafting lesson plans, reviving classical scores long buried in his memory. One afternoon, Madison walked in to find him seated at the piano, his fingers gliding through Clair de Lune, his gaze lost in time. I thought you said you were only helping for a while, she teased gently. Elijah smiled, never looking up. I thought so too. But every time I guide one of these kids, I feel like I'm alive again. The official reopening of Whitmore Legacy Studio was set for a Saturday afternoon, As autumn gold poured gently over the cobblestone streets of Savannah, Madison chose to keep the original name as a tribute. The studio wore its renewal like a quiet promise: polished hardwood floors, walls lined with student artwork and black and white portraits of Grace Whitmore in mid-lesson, mid-laughter, mid-life. Guests filled the room: former students of Grace, potential donors, local music teachers. Even the head chef from the Everly Room arrived with a tray of handmade pastries. Madison stepped to the front, her gaze sweeping over the bustling room. My mother believed music wasn't a privilege. It was a human right. Today, we aren't just reopening a studio. We're reopening a belief that every voice deserves to be heard. She turned toward Elijah, standing modestly in a soft gray suit, a navy bow tie neatly tied around his collar. And that voice tonight, she said, will come from the very person my mother would have been proudest to know. The light softened. Elijah stepped forward, slowly but with quiet confidence. He sat at the grand piano at the center of the room, his fingers resting gently on the keys, his eyes brushing past the crowd toward a framed photograph of Grace. Then he sang, not a hymn, but a classical arrangement he'd written himself, based on the first song one of his students ever sang, Shine a Little Light. His baritone voice rose, rich, warm, full of discipline, but never losing its raw truth. Every note, every lyric, carried the weight of silenced dreams, the ache of injustice, and the tender spark of hope, now blooming inside these freshly painted walls. And for the first time in years, Elijah Carter wasn't just singing. He was finally being heard. When the final note faded into the stillness, no one clapped right away. They simply sat, silent, for a moment, as if letting the song settle into their bones. Then, from a quiet corner of the room, a single clap broke through. It rippled outward, swelling like a tide. Applause rose and filled the space, not with noise, but with reverence. Madison stood motionless, tears rolling quietly down her cheek. Elijah bowed his head, not as a servant finishing a task, but as an artist finally stepping into the light. With nothing to prove and everything to offer, Whitmore Legacy Studio had opened its doors. But more than that, Elijah Carter had opened his heart. Within just a few months of its grand opening, Whitmore Legacy Studio became a beacon in the heart of Savannah. That old wooden door, once shut tight with dust and silence, now stood open every day, welcoming small footsteps carrying violins, sheet music folders, and dreams once thought too fragile to survive. Classes ran from morning until dusk. Elijah Carter, once a silent waiter in a fine dining hall, was now a dedicated, steady, and deeply respected teacher. Children who once whispered now sang boldly in choir rehearsals. In the hallway, parents from every walk of life sat side by side, talking about scales, rhythms, and what their kids had learned that day, instead of what divided them. As for Madison Whitmore, after that gala night, she was no longer just a real estate mogul, obsessed with numbers and quarterly reports. She took a step back, working behind the scenes as her mother once had, finding donors, coordinating programs, keeping the place humming. More importantly, she became the bridge between privilege and possibility, between forgotten dreams and those still being born. One afternoon, Madison was leading a group of potential donors through the studio. In one of the classrooms, a brown-skinned girl no older than 8 stood at the front, her voice a little shaky, but her eyes sparkled as if reflecting a galaxy only she could see. Elijah stood beside her, guiding her gently through the notes. One of the visitors, a well-dressed man in his 50s, leaned in and asked softly, "Where's she from?" Madison smiled, calm and clear. "She lives in a housing complex on the west side of town, mostly immigrant families. But here, where you're from matters less than what your voice dares to say." The man nodded, his eyes quieting. Elijah wasn't just teaching music. He was unfastening every nail that had ever boarded up someone's self-worth. With every songwriting class, every family recital, every tear wiped from a trembling child's cheek, He was doing what even the best-funded school systems often failed to do. He was cultivating real empathy. On one wall near the entrance, a hand-lettered quote by Grace Whitmore hung in a simple wooden frame. Music won't change the world in a day, but through each lesson, each child, each listener, it can change an entire generation. And now, that generation had begun to sing. That afternoon, golden sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore Legacy Studio, painting the drifting notes in warm amber as they floated across the rehearsal room. In the main hall, a small group of students stood in a row, eyes fixed on Elijah Carter, now Savannah's most beloved teacher. Today was a final rehearsal for the studio's first community performance. Madison Whitmore stepped in quietly, coat folded over her arm. Her eyes settled on Tyler, a 9-year-old student from the city's south side. Stepping forward, his small hand wrapped tightly around a microphone. "You ready?" Elijah asked, his voice gentle and sure. Tyler nodded, his eyes shining. When the music began, not Amazing Grace, but a reimagined piece titled New Light Rising. Each lyric rang out not as recycled hymn, but as a triumphant anthem, born from the lived experience and belief of a new generation. I once was silent, but now I sing / through every trial, hope takes wing. Madison stood beside Elijah at the back of the room. Neither spoke. They simply watched as this small boy illuminated the entire studio with a clear, fearless voice and eyes ablaze with conviction. Madison's gaze lingered on the boy, but her mind wandered back to her mother at the piano, to that gentle smile and those soft hands dancing across the keys like they were holding the world. Elijah exhaled slowly, as if Tyler's voice had lifted the weight of years of being silenced, of being dismissed because of the color of his skin. In that moment, no one needed to speak, because the music was saying everything. And when the song closed on its final line, Madison turned to Elijah, the man who once stood as a server in her birthday banquet, forced to sing, and offered a smile that was full, real, and leveled. No status, no pretense, just two people who had crossed their own thresholds to hand hope to the next. Tyler bowed. The room erupted in applause. But Elijah and Madison didn't move. They stood still, eyes forward, watching the small boy on stage, witnessing something sacred. The moment when one small voice could light the path to an entire future. Because music, when sung at the right time, in the right place, doesn't just heal the wounds of the past. It opens the doors for a generation to dream and to dare.